I think another example of Eisenhower working behind the scenes with great effect was the way he handled race relations. Now, Eisenhower, if you would ask most historians, what did Eisenhower do for civil rights and race relations? The answer would be not much, nothing. In fact, he was extremely active. He worked behind the scenes. He worked with Southern governors out of the spotlight, out of the glare of the press and the media. Got no credit at all for that, but really put a lot of pressure on Southern governors to put an end to racial discrimination. Was actually quite active early in what became the civil rights movement, but all behind the scenes, with pretty good effect. Eisenhower didn't want any publicity. He thought that publicity would tie the hands of the largely Democratic Southern governors and force them to be rather hawkish on race relations, and would actually make things worse, not better. And I think he's absolutely right on that issue. There's a limit to how much you can get done behind the scenes without going public, but it seemed to me that he accomplished really a great deal without really avoiding the glare of publicity. The real sophistication of Eisenhower shines through in his written record. He was an incredibly articulate guy, really a terrific writer. He wrote his own biography, his own history of his presidency. He started out as MacArthur's speechwriter. The public image of Eisenhower as president couldn't have been further from what the Eisenhower presidency produced internally. I think Eisenhower is a grossly underrated president of the United States. There was really quite a good record of his efforts in Little Rock, and he put a lot of pressure on, Faubus, who was governor at the time, to make use of the National Guard, which is both a federal and a state. It's a federal military unit under the command of the governor of the state. He really forced Faubus to call out the National Guard to put down the race riots that were taking place in Little Rock. So when he had to be, was extremely forceful. Actually, the desegregation in the Army really goes back to the Truman administration. I think an order was issued by Truman, but it was never made official. The pressure from Adam Clayton Powell really began in the Truman administration, during the Truman administration, and carried over to Eisenhower. And Eisenhower actually had a pretty good relationship with Adam Clayton Powell privately. At least it was cordial. It was not nearly as filled with animus as it seemed to be in public. And again, this is Eisenhower working behind the scenes quite actively and on, I think, the side of the good and the righteous. That was simply his way of getting things done and being effective. I think the military people, especially people in leadership positions, are uniquely aware of the pressures that large industrial firms dependent on military contracts for their economic well-being. They're uniquely aware of the magnitude of those pressures and how counter those pressures are on occasion to the interests of a democracy. I think his farewell address is warning of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, because it really does become a partnership between military service seeking new weapons, better weapons, more weapons, and the industrial might of the country that produces those weapons. As you'll recall, the entire economy of the U.S. following the Great Depression was mobilized for the war effort. Everything from agriculture to automobile manufacturing was turned to the war effort. Out of that alliance became this intertwining of the interests of military leadership and the leadership of these large corporations. Eisenhower saw that quite correctly as a tremendous threat to a modern democracy and warned of that, I think, in a very articulate, forceful way in his farewell address. And it was a very appropriate kind of message. There's probably only a military man that would have the credibility to say something that forceful, that could have been seen as kind of anti-military, without being subject to the criticism that a non-military person would inevitably receive. Lack of loyalty or lack of patriotism or whatever, lack of recognition of the contribution of the U.S. industry to the war effort. I mean, you can imagine the criticism that somebody without a military background would have been subjected to with that sort of message in their farewell address. and the prominence given to that message. I wrote a fair number of papers on federal budgetary and fiscal policy processes, but my research career didn't get totally sidetracked, but it certainly got slowed down a bit by my administrative responsibilities in universities. I think we spent 2 weeks there at the library. A lot of reading and, made copies of a lot of the papers. The presidential libraries are a tremendous national resource for scholars, are well staffed. The papers are well organized. The federal archivists are a terrific aid to scholars, and I think journalists would be well advised to occasionally do some research on things they write about with seeming knowledge, but not much direct evidence. At the time I went to the Eisenhower Library, I had just stepped down as first director of the Institute of Public Policy Studies, which was the first graduate public policy program in the country. Shortly thereafter, I went to Carnegie Mellon as Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, and then became provost and senior vice president, and then I became president of Georgia Tech. So I really didn't have a whole lot of time after I left the Eisenhower Library and my federal budget research. It's a political science by the name of Fred Greenstein, who wrote a book on civil rights that actually gave Eisenhower some real credit for pushing the civil rights movement and race relations behind the scenes. Fred was at Princeton when he wrote that book. He was the only one that I know of that really got it right on Eisenhower.